0217. A hospital room so quiet that even the faint, uneven rhythm of a failing breath feels too loud, the glow of medical monitors flickering softly against the walls as if trying to hold on to something already slipping away. And in that fragile moment, according to sources close to the family, Olu Jacobs, the man many grew up watching, the voice, the presence, the legend, was said to have taken his final breath at the age of 84 after a long and painful battle with late-stage cancer, a battle that had been kept away from the public eye, hidden behind silence, dignity, and the quiet strength of those closest to him. The air in the room felt heavier than grief, as if every second stretched into something unbearable, machines still humming, nurses moving slowly, carefully, almost respectfully, as though afraid to disturb what had just happened, and standing beside him, not collapsing, not screaming, not even breaking into tears at first, was Joke Silva, his wife. Her fingers wrapped tightly around his hand as if refusing to let go even when there was nothing left to hold, her face still, composed in a way that only deep, indescribable pain can create, the kind that doesn't explode outward, but sinks inward, settling somewhere beyond words. Those present would later say she didn't cry immediately, that she simply watched him, searching his face as if hoping for one last movement, one last sign, something that would say this was not the end. And yet the silence in the room answered everything. It is said that the final days leading up to this moment had been filled with a different kind of suffering, one that unfolded slowly, quietly, far from cameras and applause, where the man once known for his commanding presence was reduced to moments of exhaustion, pain that came in waves, and long nights where sleep refused to come, where even breathing felt like a struggle, and where those who loved him could do nothing but stay, wait, and hope. According to what has been shared, there were days when the pain became almost unbearable, when the body seemed to resist itself, and in those moments, the room would fall into a tense stillness, broken only by the low hum of machines and the quiet voices of doctors speaking in careful, measured tones, never too certain, always choosing their words as if the truth itself was too heavy to deliver all at once. And through it all, Joke Silva remained there, not as a public figure, not as the strong woman many had seen on screen, but as a wife watching the person she loved slip away piece by piece, holding on to fragments of who he used to be, remembering laughter that once filled rooms, remembering conversations that now existed only in silence. There are those who believe that in moments like these, time behaves differently, that minutes stretch into hours, and hours collapse into something indistinct. And perhaps that is what happened in those final days, where everything outside the hospital seemed irrelevant, distant, almost unreal, while inside every breath, every small movement, every glance carried a weight that words could not hold. Some have suggested that there were brief moments, fleeting, almost fragile, when it seemed like he might recover, when a slight change in his condition offered a fragile hope. But those moments, according to whispers, never lasted, fading as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind a deeper sense of helplessness, the kind that settles heavily on everyone in the room. And then, as the night stretched into the early hours, everything slowed, the machines, the voices, the movement, until finally there was only stillness, a stillness so complete that it felt almost unreal. And in that stillness, a life that had once commanded attention across screens and stages quietly came to an end, not with applause, not with an audience, but in a dimly lit room where the only witness that truly mattered was the woman still holding his hand. What happened in those unseen moments, behind closed doors, away from public eyes, remains something only a few can truly understand. And yet it raises a question that lingers long after the silence settles. What really unfolded in those final days that no one ever saw? What words were spoken? What fears were faced? What quiet battles were fought when the world was no longer watching? The camera, if it were there, would not pull away immediately. It would linger on that still image. A hand still holding another, a face frozen between strength and sorrow, a room filled with machines that no longer matter. Before slowly, almost reluctantly, drifting back, leaving behind a silence that feels heavier than any sound, as if the story itself is not over, only paused somewhere in the dark. 03:30. And just like that, the silence of that hospital room begins to unravel backwards, pulling everything with it into a time when nothing seemed urgent, when nothing felt irreversible, when the signs were there but too quiet to be heard, too small to be feared. And according to what some sources have suggested, it may have started years earlier in ways that felt almost ordinary. A slight fatigue that didn't quite make sense, a kind of tiredness that lingered longer than it should. The kind that sleep could not fix, dismissed at first as nothing more than age catching up. Long hours, a lifetime of work finally weighing down on a body that had given so much. There were moments, subtle but unsettling, when his gaze would drift mid-conversation, as if he had momentarily lost track of where he was, or perhaps what he was saying. A pause just long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to raise alarm. And those around him, according to whispers, would brush it off with a smile, a gentle joke, something to keep the atmosphere light, because no one wanted to be the first to say that something might be wrong. But from another angle, from a closer distance, there was someone who began to see more than what others could. Someone who noticed the patterns, the repetition, the way those small moments were no longer isolated incidents, but fragments of something forming quietly beneath the surface, and that someone was Joke Silva. It is said that she was the first to feel that something was not right, not in a dramatic, sudden realization, but in a slow, creeping awareness that built over time, the kind that grows in the silence between ordinary days, in the spaces where things don't quite add up. She began to watch more carefully, to listen more closely, noticing the way his energy seemed to fade faster than before, the way certain days felt heavier than others, and according to what has been shared, she started suggesting checkups, gently at first, casually, as if it were nothing more than routine, something everyone does. But beneath that calm suggestion was a growing concern she could not yet put into words. And so began the quiet visits, the ones no one talked about, appointments scheduled without announcement, hospital corridors walked without cameras, conversations with doctors held in low voices, filled with terms that sounded technical, distant, almost unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's story. The results, at first, were said to be inconclusive, or perhaps not alarming enough to trigger immediate fear, leaving them suspended in a space between reassurance and uncertainty. And it was in that space that tension began to grow, because uncertainty has a way of feeding itself, of turning every small symptom into a question, every silence into a possibility. There were nights, according to those close to them, when the house felt different, quieter than usual, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because something unspoken had entered the room, something that lingered in the way they looked at each other, in the way conversations would sometimes stop before reaching their natural end. And still, life continued on the surface. Appearances maintained, smiles given when needed. The world outside remaining unaware of what might have been unfolding behind closed doors. But the signs did not disappear. They returned, again and again, slightly stronger, slightly more difficult to ignore, like a message repeating itself until it could no longer be dismissed. And then, as the pace of the story begins to quicken, the tension tightening almost imperceptibly, one realization begins to take shape, not all at once, but in fragments, in pieces that slowly connect. And it becomes harder to pretend that this is just age, just fatigue, just coincidence. According to what many now reflect on, those early moments, the tiredness, the drifting gaze, the quiet hospital visits, were not random at all, but the beginning of something far more serious, something that had already started its course long before anyone fully understood it, And perhaps the most unsettling part of it all is this. At the time, no one truly believed they were standing at the edge of a journey that could not be reversed. No one imagined that those small, almost forgettable signs were the first steps toward a path that would eventually lead to that silent room at 02:17 a.m. And as the memory of those days lingers, one thought continues to echo quietly beneath everything. How many moments were overlooked? How many warnings were softened by hope? And how close were they, even then, to something they were not yet ready to face? 080. The moment no one was ready for did not arrive with noise or drama, but with a quiet sentence spoken almost too gently, as if lowering the volume could somehow soften the weight of what was being said. The doctor's voice measured, careful, each word placed with hesitation, and yet nothing could prepare them for the phrase that followed, a phrase that, according to those present, seemed to freeze the room entirely. Late-stage cancer. 2 words that did not echo, did not repeat, but instead settled heavily into the air, pressing down on everything, turning seconds into something dense and immovable. No one looked at each other immediately, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't, because meeting another person's eyes would make it real. And for a brief moment, there was an unspoken agreement to remain suspended in that thin space where denial still existed. From one side of the room, it is said Olu Jacobs did not react in the way people might expect. There was no visible shock, no sudden outburst, just a stillness, a kind of silence that felt deeper than words, as if he had already begun processing something far beyond what anyone else could reach. His gaze steady but distant, like someone watching a horizon only he could see. And beside him, Joke Silva, who had carried quiet suspicions for so long, was now faced with something that confirmed every fear she had tried to keep contained. And yet, according to sources, she did not break. Not in that moment. She held herself together with a strength that seemed almost impossible, her posture steady, her expression controlled. But there was something in her eyes, something that shifted, something that suggested the ground beneath her had just given way. Because this was not just a diagnosis, it felt like a betrayal. The kind that does not come from another person but from within, from the body itself, a body that had carried him through decades, through performances, through life, now turning against him in a way that could not be negotiated, could not be reasoned with. And alongside that, there was another kind of betrayal, quieter but just as painful, the sense that time itself had turned, that all the plans, the conversations left unfinished, the simple expectations of later had suddenly been taken away, replaced by something urgent, something final. The tension in the room did not explode, it tightened, pulling everyone inward, compressing emotion into something almost unbearable, and according to what has been whispered since, there was a moment, brief but unforgettable, when the doctor stopped speaking, when the explanation paused, and in that silence, the reality settled fully, leaving no space for misunderstanding. It is said that was the moment when everything changed, not outwardly, but internally, when the future they had quietly assumed began to collapse into something uncertain, something fragile. And then, almost as if the scene needed a breaking point, according to sources close to the situation, there came a moment that many would later describe as the most difficult to witness. The moment when Joke Silva, known for her strength, her composure, her ability to hold herself together even under pressure, simply could not find words, not because she didn't want to speak, but because there was nothing left to say, no sentence that could respond to something so final. And for the first time, those who knew her saw something different. Not weakness, but a kind of silence that carried more weight than any tears, a silence that spoke of shock, of disbelief, of a pain that had not yet found its way out. The room remained still, the doctor's voice eventually returning, explaining options, timelines, possibilities that sounded more like fragments than answers. Words like management, comfort, progression, floating in the air without truly landing. Because once that initial phrase had been spoken, everything else felt secondary. And as the seconds moved forward again, slowly, reluctantly, it became clear that this was not just the beginning of treatment, but the beginning of a different kind of journey, one defined not by certainty, but by endurance, by moments that would test not only the body, but the mind, the spirit, and the fragile balance between hope and reality. And somewhere within that room, without anyone saying it out loud, a realization began to take hold. That from this point on, nothing would ever be the same again. That every step forward would carry the weight of what had just been revealed, and that the story, which once moved with ease, had now entered a phase where every moment mattered in ways no one had been prepared for. 13. The days that followed no longer moved in a straight line. They broke apart into fragments of nights without sleep, long stretches where time lost meaning, where the only constant was the sound, that steady mechanical rhythm of a heart monitor cutting through the silence like a reminder that everything now depended on something fragile, something artificial. According to those who were there, the nights were the hardest because pain does not rest. It lingers. It returns. It intensifies when everything else grows quiet. And there were hours when Olu Jacobs could not find comfort in any position, moments where even breathing seemed to carry weight, his body no longer responding the way it once did, as if it had begun to turn against itself completely, confirming the quiet fear that had first taken shape in that doctor's office. From the perspective of a nurse who was said to have been present during several of those nights, there were times when the room felt almost suspended, where every movement had to be careful, measured, because even the smallest disturbance could trigger discomfort, and she would later recall how his eyes would open suddenly, not always in recognition, sometimes searching, sometimes distant, as though he were trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. From another angle, family members would come and go, their presence filling the room with a different kind of tension, one shaped by hope and fear existing at the same time, each visit carrying an unspoken question. Would this be the moment things change, or the moment things end? And then there was Joke Silva, always there, not leaving, not stepping away, her presence becoming a constant in a situation where everything else felt uncertain, watching, listening, holding on to every small sign, every flicker of awareness, as if those moments could somehow anchor him back to the present. But as the days passed, something else began to unfold, something more unsettling than the physical pain, something that could not be treated or managed with medication, the slow fading of memory. According to what has been shared, there were moments when he would look at those around him with a kind of confusion that was impossible to ignore, moments when names that had once come effortlessly no longer formed, when recognition itself seemed to hesitate. One of the most haunting accounts describes a moment when he reportedly paused while looking at a close family member, his expression shifting as if trying to place a face that should have been instantly familiar. And in that pause, in that brief uncertainty, the room fell silent in a different way, because everyone understood what it meant. And then, even more painful, there were instances, rare but unforgettable, when he looked at Joke Silva, the woman who had stood beside him through decades, and for a fleeting second there was no recognition in his eyes, just a distant awareness, as if she were someone else entirely. And although those moments did not always last, although sometimes clarity returned, the damage was already done, because once that line had been crossed, it could not be unseen. The rhythm of the story begins to tighten here, each moment stacking onto the next, the nights growing longer, the pain more persistent, the memories more fragile, creating a sense of inevitability that becomes harder and harder to escape. The machines continued their steady work, beeping in patterns that became almost hypnotic, while the people in the room moved carefully around them, speaking in low voices, as if louder words might somehow make the situation worse. And yet, despite everything, there were still moments, small, almost fragile, where something of the man he once was seemed to return. a brief clarity, a glance that held recognition, a faint attempt at communication, and in those moments, hope would rise again, quickly, instinctively, only to be met once more with the reality that followed. According to sources close to the situation, it was this constant rise and fall that made everything more difficult. The way hope would appear just long enough to be felt before slipping away again, leaving behind a deeper sense of loss each time. And as the timeline moves forward, the emotional weight builds toward something almost unbearable, because this was no longer a single moment of goodbye. It was a process, a gradual separation happening in real time, piece by piece, memory by memory, until what remained was not just physical suffering, but the quiet, relentless experience of losing someone while they were still there. And in the middle of it all, one image seems to stay, repeated in different forms, like a memory that refuses to fade. A dimly lit room, the sound of a monitor echoing softly, and a woman sitting beside a man who is still present, yet already slipping away, her hand resting over his, holding on not just to him, but to everything they once were, even as it slowly, painfully, begins to disappear. 1830. The story folds back into that same night, the same room, but now everything feels slower, heavier, as if time itself is reluctant to move forward. The air thick with something unspoken, something that everyone present can feel but no one dares to name. And according to those who were there, the sound that once filled the space, the steady, reassuring rhythm of the monitor, begins to change, not abruptly, not dramatically, but subtly at first. A shift in tone, a hesitation in pattern, as though the body is quietly reaching its limit. The lights remain dim, the shadows stretching across the walls, and every small movement becomes amplified. The rustle of fabric, the soft steps of a nurse approaching, the faint exhale that seems longer than the ones before, and in that moment, all attention narrows to a single point, to a single breath that feels as though it carries the weight of everything that came before it. From the perspective of someone standing near the door, it is said the room felt suspended, as if no one was fully present in reality anymore, as if they were all waiting for something they already understood but could not accept. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sound changes again. A pause, a gap where there should have been continuity, followed by a tone that lingers just a fraction too long, and although no one speaks, the meaning of it begins to settle into the room like a quiet, undeniable truth. Beside the bed, Joke Silva does not move suddenly, does not react in a way that draws attention. Instead, she remains exactly where she has been, her hand still wrapped around his, holding on with a steadiness that seems almost unreal, as if the act of holding is the only thing keeping the moment from fully collapsing. According to sources, there is no cry, no outburst, no visible breaking point, only a stillness, a silence that feels deeper than anything that came before, her head lowering slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though the weight of the moment is pressing down from above, forcing everything inward. The machines, once active, begin to lose their purpose, the rhythm fading, the sound stretching into something continuous, something final, and in that instant, the room shifts from waiting to knowing, from uncertainty to something absolute. It is said that no one immediately steps forward. No one rushes to fill the silence because there is nothing that can be done, nothing that can be changed. And in that shared stillness, a collective understanding takes hold, one that does not need to be spoken aloud. No one said it, according to what has been quietly shared, but everyone understood what had just happened. And perhaps that is what makes the moment so heavy. Not the noise, not the reaction, but the absence of both. The way everything simply stops, leaving behind a space that feels impossibly vast. From another angle, a nurse might gently reach toward the equipment, her movements careful, respectful, as if acknowledging not just the end of a life, but the presence of those still standing there, trying to process something that cannot be processed all at once. And still, at the center of it all, there is that image that refuses to fade. A hand that had been held so tightly, now slowly, almost reluctantly, loosening. Not because it is being released, but because there is nothing left to hold on to. And yet even then, the connection remains. Not physical, but something deeper, something that lingers in the space between two people who have shared a lifetime. The camera, if it were there, would not cut away. It would stay, capturing the stillness, the bowed head, the unmoving figure beside the bed, the quiet presence of others who do not know where to look. And as seconds pass, stretching into something longer, heavier, one realization begins to settle into everything. That this moment, so quiet, so restrained, is the culmination of everything that came before, every sign, every fear, every hope, leading here, to a point where nothing more can be done, nothing more can be said. And yet, even as the scene holds, even as the silence deepens, there is something unresolved that remains, something that does not end with the final breath. Because what follows is not immediate closure, not release, but a lingering presence, an absence that feels almost tangible, filling the room long after the sound has faded, long after the machines have gone still, leaving behind only the image of a woman who does not cry, who does not move, who simply remains. Her head lowered, her hand still resting where his once responded, as if waiting, even now, for something that will not come. 22. Wow. The sound has already faded, the urgency has already passed, and what remains is something quieter, something heavier, a stillness that does not ask for attention, but slowly fills every corner of the room. And now there are no more voices explaining, no more machines insisting on their rhythm, only the space that is left behind, a space that feels unfamiliar, even though nothing has physically changed. The bed is still there, the sheets slightly creased as if holding the memory of movement, the faint outline of where a body once rested now becoming just another shape in the fabric. And nearby, a chair remains in the exact position it was left, unmoved, as though time had paused around it, waiting for someone to return and continue a moment that has already ended. A piece of clothing, not yet folded, rests quietly on a surface, its presence small but strangely significant, a reminder of something unfinished, something that no longer has a reason to be completed, and in that detail, the absence becomes more visible than anything else. The room does not announce what has happened. It does not change dramatically. It simply continues to exist, carrying within it a silence that feels deeper than before. From a distance, through a doorway or perhaps from the corner of the room, there is a figure standing alone, and according to what one might imagine, that figure is Joke Silva, no longer surrounded by voices or movement, no longer holding on to a moment that needed her strength, but simply standing, facing a space that no longer responds, her posture still, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond what is visible, as if searching not for answers, but for something that cannot be returned. There are no tears described here, no visible collapse, only a quiet presence that carries everything inward, the kind of silence that does not need to be explained because it is already understood. Time, in this moment, does not move forward in any noticeable way. It stretches, it lingers, it allows every small detail to settle, the faint light entering through a window, touching the edges of objects that remain exactly where they were, the soft shadow cast across the floor, the subtle shift of brightness that suggests the world outside is continuing as it always does. And somewhere within that stillness, a thought begins to take shape, not as a conclusion, not as something final, but as a reflection that drifts quietly through the space. There are losses that do not arrive all at once, that do not exist only in a single moment, but unfold gradually, across days, across memories, across the quiet recognition of absence in places that once felt complete. The camera, if it were present, would not rush this moment. It would remain, allowing the emptiness to speak in its own way, capturing not what is happening, but what is no longer there. And then, almost imperceptibly, attention shifts to a small detail that now carries a weight far greater than its size. A framed photograph placed carefully on a table, the image of Olu Jacobs preserved in a moment that no longer exists, his expression unchanged, his presence intact within the borders of the frame, untouched by time, untouched by everything that has followed. A beam of light reaches across the room, slowly finding its way to that photograph, illuminating it gently, as if for a brief moment something is being remembered. Something is being held in place just a little longer, and then, just as quietly, that light begins to fade, retreating inch by inch until the image is left in shadow once more. Nothing dramatic happens after that. No final movement, no closing gesture, only the continuation of silence, the room remaining exactly as it is, unchanged, complete in its stillness, and yet undeniably different. Because everything that once gave it meaning is no longer present, and what remains is not emptiness, but something heavier, something that lingers in the space between objects, between memories, between moments. The room is still there, the chair is still there, the photograph is still there, but he is not.